All right, welcome back to the House Judiciary Committee this Wednesday morning, April 23rd. And we have planned all day S12, the sealing and expungement bill. And we have several witnesses that we're going to hear from this morning and after the floor this afternoon. So we're going to start with trying to have a better understanding of some of the systems that contain documents that might be sealed or expunged, trying to kind of really understand the operation of how that part works. So we have a witness from the Vermont Crime Information Center, and then we have a witness who is an expert on the ValCore system. So we can really understand how those systems are holding documents and what happens when a document is expunged and what happens differently if a document is sealed. So we'll start with Jeffrey Wallen. Thank you very much for being here, and thanks for your patience. I'm assuming you're being patient as and it seems like there's a lot of people missing. There's, it's a break week for certain schools, so we have lost a couple members there. A couple members should be joining us in either online or in person shortly. So proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. And for the record, my name is Jeffrey Wallen. I'm the director of the Vermont Crime Information Center. Just a little bit of background. And as always, when I come before any group within the legislature, hopefully I can answer questions. That's my main goal here today, but I'll have some background information to share as well. And just as a high level background, the Vermont Crime Information Center, or VCIC, is the criminal history repository for the state of Vermont. And that means we keep a log of arrests, arraignments, and convictions within the state. You often hear that referred to as a rap sheet. And that's different, as you're going to hear later, from a record system that an agency uses for their own business and their own interactions. There is some overlap as far as what data they may hold, but they're maintained separately and provided and managed separately. Here in our Vermont criminal history.
One second, Ken, go ahead.
So they're managed and handled different, right?
Yes, sir.
But are they shared information when needed?
Information between the rap sheet and the records management system, there is no sharing between those two. There's not a linkage between those two. Those are maintained separately.
Why is there not more sharing done?
That's a good question. And I think some of it comes down to there are different ways data is managed. So for example, everything in the criminal history repository is identity proofed. So it's based on a fingerprint identification that the individual is the individual. Or with the records management system, it's not fingerprint managed or maintained. So a Jeffrey Wallen in a rap sheet has been verified to be that person. A Jeffrey Wallen in a record system may or may not be Jeffrey Wallen. That's just the name that's provided, the name that's attached. They may not be the same individuals. So that's probably the biggest single reason why those records may be maintained separately, because one is an identity proofed record and the other is not.
But your paths are still going to cross when you're going down the path to investigate or do due diligence to what needs to be done, right?
Well, there may be information, not necessarily linked, but there may be information that's contained in both those records. For example, if someone is arrested, there would in theory be a record made in a record system that Jeff Wallen was arrested for underwater basket weaving, my favorite fake crime. And then we hopefully will get fingerprints for that, and that entry goes into the rap sheet as well, when that happens. So the incident may be reflected in both places, but it's not, data isn't simply moved from one system to the other because they're maintained separately.
Data is, but the knowledge is not.
There certainly will be pieces of information that are in both. Certainly they're in both.
Okay, thank you.
And to follow up on that, just as an example, I looked this morning before I came over in our Vermont Criminal History Repository. We have over 263,000 individuals reflected in the Vermont Criminal History Repository. Now, keep in mind, one of the questions that I commonly get is how many Vermont residents have records? There's no way to know that because we don't capture residency. And also you can have a scenario where someone maybe lives in New York, comes over, commits a misdemeanor infraction, is convicted and goes back. They're not a Vermont resident. Similarly, you may have a Vermont resident that goes to my home state of Tennessee, commits an infraction, is ultimately found guilty. We don't have a record of that in our systems because it was in the courts of Tennessee, not the courts of Vermont. So That number doesn't represent a percentage of anything. It's simply a volumetric piece of information. And I share that as a way of put some scope around the total amount of records within the national conversation on this. Vermont, as I'm sure everyone well knows, is the second smallest state by population, and we have over 263,000 or over 250,000 individuals. You can imagine states like California, Texas, Illinois, New York have much, much larger criminal history repositories that they manage as well. So I share that as just a little bit of context for that and the amount of information that we contain within our criminal history repository. There are a few other programs within VCIC as well that I won't be talking about in depth today, but I share in case any questions ever come up. We're happy to provide that as well. These include the Sex Offender Registry is maintained within VCIC, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or NIBRS. You may hear that if you read literature on that. That is a national data collection. Also, our fingerprint processing for both our criminal and non-criminal events handles within VCIC. And also we're our single point of contact for NCIC, or the National Crime Information Center, which is most commonly understood to be wants, warrants, missing persons, et cetera, maintained within that system. So all those have a nexus within VCIC. Our database that we manage that contains records of arrest, arraignments, and convictions is structured in a manner what we call ACT, or accurate, complete, and timely. That's the goal of that, and it's to provide an accurate, complete, and timely records to law enforcement agencies doing law enforcement work or criminal justice purposes, as you hear it structured. So it's structured that way in a reason, and things are noted within that system for a reason. When information goes to non-law enforcement agencies, for example, someone applying to get a teaching license, they don't have direct access to that. It comes through us, we filter it and review it, and will, for example, if a record is sealed, not provide that information to the Agency of Education because they're not authorized to receive it. But it does require human intervention. It's not something that can automatically be done within the system. It requires human intervention to make sure that that's what is passed along to those non-law enforcement agencies is provided appropriately and accurately. In talking about expunged and sealed, these are words in different states that can mean different things. So when looking at the national literature, it can quickly become a potato type of conversation. And so by way of explaining how we operationalize those here in Vermont and within VCIC, if something is expunged, it's as if it never happened. It's completely deleted, removed from all systems we maintain in VCIC, and that includes our federal partners. They no longer have that information. A common question we receive: if someone were to have a felony expunged, would they still be barred from purchasing a firearm? If that felony conviction was the only thing that was barring them from being eligible to purchase, own, et cetera, a gun, they would then have had their rights restored. For that, there's no double secret probation, if you will, list of individuals prohibited or barred from owning or purchasing firearms. Similarly, a record that's sealed is flagged as such. I won't go too far into the weeds on that, but rather than a conviction, it is shown as sealed, and it does not go out to non-law enforcement agencies, but a law enforcement agency would seal that event, that arrest, arraignment, conviction had been sealed, and then would treat it however they are required or directed to treat that. But the data does remain in our system and simply flagged as sealed. I would also note that there's no single database, or there is a single database, excuse me, there's no separate database for firearm purchases or research. That's another common question comes up. Well, if something is expunged, it's still available for research purposes. Not within our records, it's not. We remove that expunged record, and it's as if it never happened. I would also mention either a sealing or an expungement from a processing perspective is essentially the same amount of time. There really isn't any time saved by doing a sealing versus an expungement from our perspective. Others may have different reaction to that. But from our perspective, while I haven't counted the number of mouse clicks, it's essentially a very, very similar process. So it's not as if we move to one or the other, it saves us a great deal of time in processing as far as that goes. And so let me pause there. I've thrown a lot of acronyms and information at the committee. So let me pause and answer any questions that I may.
Barbara.
So that's super helpful. I'm wondering if a record is sealed and you have the non-law enforcement request, is the process to give that information going to be the same whether something was expunged or sealed, or will that be different?
So that's a great question. Thank you. If something is expunged, there's no real action to take because it's not there. That we don't have to engage in any mental gymnastics because it's gone. There's nothing to react to. With a sealed record, we would see that, okay, Jeffrey Wallen was arraigned, and then his underwater basket weaving, conviction was sealed, or it would just say sealed. It wouldn't show a conviction anymore. We would not provide that. That is like a human to go, whoop, this isn't relevant. We're not providing this to AOE or the Burlington schools or whatever it be. So with an expungement, there's nothing to do because it's just gone. It's simply not there anymore. With a sealing, it does require, now it's fairly straightforward. You go, oh, it's sealed, I don't provide it. Fairly straightforward, but it does require a human to look at that and make that valuation.
Yeah, go ahead.
So as we go to sealing, and I hope we do, is there more than one person that makes the decision that that's the route that's going to be looked at? In other words, is it more than one person that follows stuff through, so there's more of a trail and not a group, but what's the word I want to use? Yeah, back. I don't know who said that, but that's good.
So I'll explain our process, and maybe that'll help, but it might form your question or clarify. When we receive an order from the court for a sealing, that's received by, we have two individuals who receive that. They then review the record, update it as directed by the court order, and then it's quality checked by a second person. That update is quality checked by a second person, and then the record is as it is now noted as sealed as such. So that's our process.
Okay, thank you.
The upstream effects of what leads to a sealing order being issued is outside of our purview.
Right. I understand that part. Thank you.
So just, I'm going to ask a couple of very simple questions, so you just have records of convictions, right? And it doesn't have, you don't have records of whether somebody has served their time or been incarcerated or released. Tell me a little more about what the records actually.
No, thank you, Representative. That's a good question. And what we will receive is a record of an arrest, arraignment, a conviction, and a sentence, but not whether the actual individual ever actually was incarcerated, et cetera, et cetera. We simply receive that what we would call that sentence information. So if someone was sentenced to 1 to 5 years incarceration, we won't know if they ever were actually incarcerated, if they were immediately released on cognizance. We won't have that information, but we will have the sentence information when it's provided by the court. So we will have that. And that's occasionally a question that we get from our partners is, okay, was this individual incarcerated and I have to refer them to the Department of Corrections? We don't know. We just know the sentence was X.
And you don't keep arrest records unless there's also a conviction. Is that correct?
Ultimately, once the original arrest comes in, we hold on that until the court procedure completes itself. And then if there's a non-conviction, we remove that information. We remove those fingerprints and that information from our systems.
Okay. So, all right. So the documents come to you when there's an arrest with fingerprint information that's held. But if it's non-conviction, it goes away automatically, or
no, it doesn't. I thank you for that. We will go through and remove the fingerprints and remove the other information from our systems so that it no longer shows up in any fingerprint supported check of that individual. So, and it's noted as it was a non-conviction. So
I guess this may not be a question for you, may be a question for Christina, of whether those arrest records stay in Belcor after, if they ends up not being a conviction. But I don't know if that's the question. Maybe
that would be outside of what I could.
No, I'll ask that. So a couple more.
You still have a record if there's an acquittal?
So if there's anything other than a conviction, so any type of non-conviction status, we will go through and remove those fingerprints and remove that information from our system. It will still show that an arrest was made, because we do have that information, but it's not available on a fingerprint supported check. It doesn't come back as simply an entry in there. And then if we receive a sealing or expungement order, we will remove it. Especially an expungement order, we will remove it at that time. What we often, although not always, operationally see is we will see, sometimes even before we get a notice of the non-conviction, we'll get an expungement order and we'll remove it at that time. So there can occasionally be information in our system, just to clarify, that may show an arrest happened and we're waiting for the final court paperwork as far as should it be expunged? Should it be, what should it? But we remove those fingerprints as soon as we're known so they don't show up on a fingerprint check.
So, if law enforcement asks for a sealed record, they are able to obtain it at this point?
That's a very good question. Thank you. Essentially, a record is flagged as sealed in our system now, so it's there. So if a law enforcement entity were to query, they would see that and it would show as sealed. They don't have to ask for it necessarily. It would simply show as sealed. So as an example, if I had, I'll use my other fake crime for myself. So if I had two incidents within the rap sheet. My rap sheet, one was safe cracking and the other was underwater basket weaving. And the underwater basket weaving had been sealed, it would show as sealed. You would see arrest, arraignment, and then sealed. And if my safe cracking conviction was still there, you'd see that I was convicted for safe cracking as well.
So law enforcement and presumably state's attorneys have direct access to that?
So the only individuals that have direct access, which is to say they can run a query on a computer,
Right.
use that terminology, would be law enforcement agencies. Our state's attorneys do not have terminal access, neither do our courts. As I believe I understand it, maybe the others could provide more clarity, but typically the state's attorney will request or receive that information from law enforcement and they then enter that into the court record. So a prosecutor or defense attorney and the judiciary would see it, they can't run the queries themselves.
Right, okay. And maybe this is more a question for law enforcement as far as the different reasons that they access that information. I know that's a very simplified question, and I just need to understand that.
Well, and I think I would definitely defer as far as examples, of how that may work. What we typically see is within our and other statutes, within 20 VSA and other statutes, their criminal justice purposes is defined. And so those are the reasons that an entity can query whether or not a particular activity is a criminal justice purpose. We would defer to others on that for that. So,
So is there, as far as S12 itself, are there any flags that you have or anything that particular issues?
yeah. So first, I appreciate the work that was done on the version as it first was released versus what has made it over to this chamber. There were definitely some things we had operational concerns about when that was first released. As it comes through now, the biggest question that I have, or I guess concern, I guess I would have to be candid, would the concept of requesting to access a record. So right now, that a law enforcement agency can request to access a sealed record. And there's two questions that come up with that. First of all, how would we would have to create a new database to maintain that information separately that we could release to law enforcement when they asked, or when it was approved to be released to. That's not how our data is currently structured. And as with all IT projects, it's not a question of if, it's how much and how long, how expensive and how long will it take to do for that. And so there's a question there we have of how would we maintain those sealed records? Where would we maintain them so that then if it was approved, we could then release that information to law enforcement, because that's not how our data is structured now. I believe some information either has or will be shared. The idea of utilization versus access is a concept here for that. But just strictly from a repository perspective, we're not sure how we would, quite frankly, suppress those records and then make them available upon release. We don't have any mechanism or any type of technology currently available to us that would facilitate that particular activity.
It's all in one single database. It's just flagged as sealed. So essentially, if it was access, you would probably have to cut off law enforcement from having the direct access that they have already, presumably.
Or we would have to essentially treat it as an expungement and remove it and then keep it somewhere. I don't know where, and keep it somewhere. But then it could be reinstated or provided to law enforcement in that capacity. But that would be nothing that our current systems are set up or structured for.
And so I'm looking at, you may not have the bill in front of you, but on page 25, I think where you're referring to, it's subdivisions C, 2A, and B, and C3 as well. All have that language of access, and understanding that you prefer or believe that that's unworkable, and would want that to say use instead of access.
Well, and I would certainly defer to the committee and others on the exact language, but the concept of having a second set of data that can be brought in optionally or upon request is not anything that we have currently in our structures and our data systems for that. So,
And you wouldn't be weighing in on whether the use is appropriate or not. That's outside. What you're just providing is the access.
we do provide access to that. I will say, though, we do VCIC. One of the roles that we fill is we are considered the CJIS systems agency for Vermont, and that is the Criminal Justice Services Information, and that is where our federal authority comes from. And we do review and audit every law enforcement agency in the country once every 3 years, or excuse me, not the country. That would be a big task. State once every, it feels like it some days, but once every 3 years. So we will go through and pull a selection, for example, of the queries that agency ran to say, why did you do this? And if something comes up that's patently, for example, I was leasing, my assistant called because they're going to lease something. So we ran the individual to see if they had a criminal history record would not be an appropriate use of that database. And so we would provide that feedback to them for that. So we do audit agencies once every 3 years. The FBI also comes in every 3 years and audits VCIC and also a selection of agencies around the state. So there is some oversight into that. We do look at that. We also respond to queries if an agency, who often those are the best, those are the individuals best situated to know if there's some question they have about operations within their agency. They may ask, can you pull all of the queries that an individual or we ran for this period? We can work with our IT support to provide that so they can review it to say, hey, were all these legitimate or not? So it's not as if we're operating in an accountability vacuum, but I have one person doing that for over almost 100 agencies statewide. So it's a meaningful but limited amount of oversight.
Yeah, fine.
So I have two questions about that. That's really interesting. One is, do you publish the results of those audits of like who was in compliance? And who was not?
We do not publish those. There's a lot of restricted information even in the audit results and response, so we don't make those public.
So I appreciate that you're a check and balance, but what if you send it to the police chief, let's say in a town, and he was the one that maybe misused it. You're sending him the audit results saying you misused it. And he's like, delete. That's like, right. Like there's nothing happens.
It's a fair question, Representative, and I haven't come across that myself in my time, almost 15 years in Vermont criminal justice. Having said that, if it is, then I would probably speak with people above me on the food chain to go, what do we do with this? Because the person who's suspected of misusing data is also the agency head. And we would have to have a conversation about what avenues, who do we talk to, et cetera. It would not go undiscussed, certainly, but I can't spell out what would happen because there's so many different hypotheticals there.
And you don't know what people do with this information, right? Like, assuming it's not a police chief. I mean, like you're sending them like, whoa, you've had a couple of misuse. I don't know how frequent there are misuses.
The most common thing we see is people not misusing data, but they're miscoding their query. So when you make a query of a database, it's what purpose are you doing it? And they sometimes click the wrong dropdown. It doesn't change what they get. It's just coded wrong. So we provide feedback on that. With any complex data system, there's a lot of human interaction. And so as people can occasionally click the wrong button, click the wrong dropdown, what have you. Quite often they identify it themselves where we do. Like, I ran the wrong thing. Okay, no problem. We work with them and go from there. That's the most common issue that we see. Occasionally, if we do see somebody we can understand why they're doing something, it's just not quite correct, then we'll work with them to address that should that come up and move forward. And it's very, very rarely do people push back beyond, okay, now I know. Before my current role, and I've shared this with others within my agency, I worked in financial aid for 10 years. I worked at the University of Maryland and the University of Vermont. And we would often have to explain very arcane rules around financial aid applications to individuals. Mm-hmm. And broadly speaking, if somebody failed to provide information such as the $2 million in a trust that they have, They didn't know that they needed to provide that. They understand the rules. They don't like it, but okay, now I understand the rules and move forward. Most people fall into that category. Occasionally, you would get individuals that didn't, and we would escalate those conversations. The same thing here. Broadly speaking, if we find someone, and it's not common at all, that maybe ran something for a reason you could understand, but wasn't actually within bounds, we provide that education and information to them, and then they adjust their procedures and move forward. It's very, very rare that we would see anything that leads to malice or gross misuse. It's often just a misunderstanding or miscoding of data.
And my second, so the FBI come in to audit every 3 years, but do they have like ongoing access to its records? So if somebody wanted to see if, so I'm just wondering if this is a way for the FBI to have access to who might have committed crimes, depending on their immigration status, let's say.
The principles that we work, so that's a good question, Representative. The principles we work from is an authorized person, authorized purpose. So you have to be an authorized individual to be requesting the data, and it has to be an authorized purpose as established in state or federal statute. I certainly can't get into specifics of whether one reason would or would not be an authorized purpose, but those exist. They're typically enshrined in federal statute first, and then they flow down to the state. And so whether you're a federal or state partner, you have to follow the same rules for accessing any Vermont criminal history information, or for any other state for that matter, and vice versa. If we want to query, we do have a few sex offenders, for example, that their convictions out of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They're out of the military services. And so in order to get those records, we have to be an authorized purpose asking for an authorized reason, because the person is in Vermont. We want to make sure, do they need to register or not with the registry? So we have to note that when we make that, where the system won't respond if we don't properly submit that request. So there is a playing field that everybody, regardless of who you are, big, small, or in between, have to follow for that. But beyond that, I can't really get into the specifics of each individual agency at the federal or state level.
Ian.
So I think with your concern for S12 you identified makes me realize that I don't quite understand yet how this works. So I apologize, sort of make you explain it a second time. But so can you explain what the difference is between how law enforcement can access the records right now versus how they would access it if this were to move forward, S12 were to move forward as we're looking at it right now?
Certainly. And I never, we were speaking before on the sides. This is, for those of us, again, I've been in this 15 years. I think of a colleague in Nebraska who's been in this for 30 years, and we're always learning new things and new wrinkles to this world. So it is not a straightforward thing, as much as we wish it was some days. But essentially what happens right now is if there is an interaction that rises to the level of a criminal justice purpose, so it's an authorized query, you submit that query and you would then get a return, and that's done at a computer terminal. Yep. Typically in Vermont, we see it mostly, although not exclusively, it's your dispatchers and your admins. There are some officers who have mobile data terminals who will do that queries themselves. But often it's to support, they're calling it in and they're saying it's X, they run it, provide that information back. And it would show, for example, if somebody had 2 cycles, which is what we see in arrest, arraignment, and conviction, a cycle, we would see that it would show at the end, this has been sealed. So an arrest, arraignment, it's been sealed. Okay, so the individual interacting with that knows that has been sealed, and then whatever restrictions or authorities that flow from that sealing, they would have to follow.
And which individual are you talking about? The person in or the person making that?
So the individual making the query,
okay,
is going to see that.
Okay, they'll see sealed.
It would show that, yes, Representative, would show that as sealed for that purpose. So they would see that information, and then depending on if they're running it on behalf of someone else, then they would communicate that information to that other individual. For that, if it's expunged, it's gone. There's nothing even to, again, think through, because it's just not there. Yeah. Once we receive the order, process it. But there, and sometimes we get folks who call from the courthouse, I just got an expungement, and I get, well, first we have to let the court send it to us, and then we have to process and quality check it. So it does take a little time for that, but we do process that as quickly as we can and move forward. So the idea is to provide the most information possible to an authorized individual for an authorized purpose in a total manner. So they can then make the necessary judgments for their investigation, for officer and public safety, for whatever purpose it might be. So that's how it's currently structured. There's no filter. It simply goes, but it's noted this has been sealed. The concept of access versus use, I'm not even sure how we could frankly, we'd have to completely remove that data from the current system and generate some new system to hold those sealed records to then could be released upon approval.
And I think, so when they're getting the query right now and they get this record is sealed, are they able to access the sealed record?
So that's a good question. So let me try to play it back to you a little bit differently.
I think the terminology is part of what it's.
It is challenging. The information we maintain is all digital. We don't really maintain documents per se. So it's digital. So it's literally just text. It says, Mr. Wallen was arrested for this, arraigned for this, and then disposition, convicted, sealed, whatever it might be. So it's all digital data. So they're seeing that all in one fell swoop, the entirety of that for that. So it doesn't say at the top it's sealed. It says at the bottom, what happened? It was sealed. Okay. So then they prosecute that. Maybe not the best word to use, but they act on that, as appropriate from that. So they would see that Mr. Wallen was arrested for underwater basket weaving, arraigned in court for underwater basket weaving, and then the underwater basket weaving was sealed. That would be the last thing they would see in that order. So it's not a matter of then clicking it to get it. That's all we have. That's what we have. If they wanted to review court documentation, if they wanted to review the original narrative, they would have to go to the individuals that hold those documents within Carlos and PCIC. Does that help?
That helps a lot.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we would. So yeah, that makes a lot more sense. And you. No, I think that I don't have any more questions. That's great. Thank you. You guys go through this last year, like all of that?
I don't think we went it quite as in depth as we are going this morning. Let me just ask a follow-up question then to Karen. So are federal agencies, are they authorized to access this information?
If they're a federal criminal justice agency engaged in criminal justice work, they would be authorized. Yes.
So the definition of criminal justice agencies includes federal, not just Vermont agencies that allocate at least 50% of the agency's annual appropriation for criminal justice purposes?
That and then
come from somewhere else.
Well, I believe that there's a federal nexus to that as well. I believe there were some opinions a number of years ago at the federal level that spoke to that 50 plus $1 concept. Plus, it also has to be a criminal justice purpose. So if it is a criminal justice agency who's asking for a non-criminal justice purpose, they're not authorized to do that work. So it doesn't get you.
Right, I understand that part, but the criminal justice purpose as defined by Vermont statute, or can there be some criminal justice purpose that is defined by federal statute?
There certainly could be both. I don't want to speculate too much on federal law because I'm not really an expert on that. But there are, for example, national security, concerns which we don't prosecute within Vermont per se. But they go through the normal congressional process, and then all states provide feedback to the FBI and DOJ on that. Because at the end of the day, the vast majority of records, criminal history records that exist, are state records. They're owned and maintained by the states. And for the federal government to have access to those, they need to play by the same rules everyone else does.
And perhaps you would not have an opinion on this part, and we'll ask somebody else as far as whether we can put any limits on access to sealed documents by federal agencies.
I wouldn't really be able to comment. From a technology perspective, it wouldn't be particularly workable. It's the same issue for that, but I'd have to defer to others on the broader policy question.
Wouldn't essentially be, they don't have access. They can't do searches on our this Vermont database. They can ask you for information on particular individuals, right? Or do they have access?
Well, they trying to think of the best way to phrase this. The queries come in and they're digital in nature. So whether it be a federal agency or my home state of Tennessee, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, they can't directly themselves query the Vermont criminal history databases, and they don't have a direct tunnel or pipeline. However, they can submit an electronic query that comes through, and then our system automatically responds to that query, through that process. So there's a handoff and handshake that does happen in the process, but that's automatic. We don't vet those queries when they come in. We don't, and there are billions of queries a year that go across. I don't know if anybody has the capacity to filter those or try to make a determination on whether any of those are, the federal agencies also audit themselves. I mean, they are audited themselves by the DOJ and also their OIGs as far as are they using their systems appropriately.
So you wouldn't, the system wouldn't know if it's an authorized criminal justice purpose. I mean, it's assumed if the other state or federal are querying that it is an appropriate use.
The way that would come through is it would have to be flagged as a criminal justice query. So it would have to be submitted as such. And then it would be up to that state. For example, I use my home state of Tennessee. They audit all their agencies as well. So they audit, for example, if Sullivan County, my home county, were to query someone as a criminal justice purpose, they would then get audited to say, was this actually a criminal justice purpose? And they would have to verify that there. And then again, the same thing, every state and all the federal agencies have federal oversight as well.
And presumably there's so-called committees. So, we get the same treatment elsewhere if we go to another state to do a query, right? I mean, that the same thing generally happens.
That's correct. That's correct.
It's not you, it's law enforcement, presumably going to another state.
That's correct. I mean, I often try to visualize it as a spider web where there's different entry points and data can move along multiple different paths to get where it needs to go. But at all points, it's tracked. And at all points, it's noted, why is it being asked? And if someone says it's for a criminal justice purpose, then we have full faith, in that query being legitimate, and vice versa. When a Vermont agency submits a query to Tennessee or to the Department of Defense or whomever, it's flagged as a criminal justice purpose, it's assumed that that's correct.
Karen. And then
I apologize that I was late, so maybe this has already been covered. But am I understanding that you are not in favor of how it's listed currently, where they have to file a petition and do that compared to the current system? Is that?
That would be correct, Representative, simply because we have no way to do that. We would have to generate a whole new data set and data system to do that. And I don't know how we would go about doing that. Essentially we'd be creating some type of third criminal history database, which would require an investment of time and resources and finance to put into place. So that's not something we would support necessarily. Our current system does flag that as such, and then I think it really becomes incumbent upon the individual receiving the data. What can they do with the sealed record to follow whatever rules exist?
And you said that folks are audited. So if they put in a query that's for a criminal activity, then that is then audited to see, was it really? So would that be a part of if this was set up, could that be a part of the auditing, being like, oh, did you actually file a petition to be able to get access to it? Or that would be a whole nother system?
I think that would be a whole different, because again, it wouldn't be in that system. And I think that would be a substantial expansion of our role and responsibilities to be auditing where court documents filed, et cetera, because we don't do that now. We receive information from the court. We don't ask them to show their math, if you will, as far as that goes. So.
And was all this shared in the other body and just kind of was pushed to the side, or was there a?
Well, I wouldn't presume to remember exactly what I said, a few month or two ago exactly. But the broad concern about having a single data set and then really putting guidance on how it can be used is in our perspective and from the repository perspective, a better way to go than trying to segment data into different pieces and regulate who has access to what piece of data. As far as that goes, it can lead to unintended consequences. And it's also, again, there's a challenge of how to even structure that. At some point, if it were to be pursued more fully, it's probably worth at some point having folks from ADS to talk about how long would this take? How much would it cost? What would the appropriation need to be to support a new data system on top of the ones we already have for that? So that certainly would have been shared in that discussion, But I will say that the original language that we were providing had many more carve-outs. And so we were, quite frankly, just refocused on that. You don't want to create a scenario where a licensing agency has access to a record, but a law enforcement agency for a criminal justice purpose doesn't. That creates some logical inconsistencies. So I think that was a lot of what we were talking about on the other side of the building, if you will.
And so if this passed like this, you would not be able to work with it.
As it's structured, I'm not sure how we would. I mean, of course, if it were to be passed and signed, we would then figure out what to do and what requests to make. We do our best to follow the rules and laws, as everyone does, but I don't know how we would do it. So it would require a lot of head scratching and a lot of analysis to figure out how do we implement that as it's structured.
Okay. Thanks for catching up and
No.
continue to listen.
Absolutely.
Good information to have.
Thank you. Okay, did you have questions?
Do we have, is there a lot of federal funding that helps fund all the programs that you're working with?
As far as VCIC, there isn't a great deal of federal funding. We occasionally do get some small grants for new computers, things of that nature, but we don't have any staff positions that are primarily funded or anything of that nature through federal funds.
The backup programs and all that stuff, the worldwide, I guess, the national.
Well, those systems, as far as paying for example, our Vermont telecommunications switch, et cetera, we certainly don't get primary funding from the federal government for that. As far as the national systems, I mean, those, my guess, would be funded directly by the DOJ and they're maintained by the DOJ. So we're not involved in those backup systems at the national or federal level.
Any other questions for Jeffrey? Thank you as always.
Thank you.
Having you here. Appreciate testimony. So I'll go to Christina next and dig deep into the world of Valcor.
Mm.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for being here as well.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. Just a little background. So I'm Christina Lynch. I worked in law enforcement for about 30 years. Started dispatching St. Albans City Police back in the early 90s. I went to state police for a short period of time, and then I ended at the Franklin County Sheriff's Office for 20 years. I was a dispatch supervisor. I was the bookkeeper. I was the NCIC tech. I was the NIBRS auditor, and pretty much anything else that was put on my plate by Sheriff Norris at the time.
Enough said.
There we go. So upon leaving my employ with the Sheriff's Office, I then took just a very short job with the courts in Franklin County, being a court security officer. So I got a little exposure to the court side of things. And then I started my own consulting company, and I went after a contract with Crosswind Technologies, who are the developers of the Valcor system. And I was hired as the customer support / subject matter expert / I test all of the development, and I document all of the development that goes on in Valcor. I do provide training to agencies on the proper use of Valcor as well. So some things that I heard in Director Wallen's testimony that I think I can give a little clarification on is when we're talking about sealed documents, the documents themselves don't live at VCIC. When a query is done, there's no sort of link that they can click on to get that information. All of that information, the sealed documents, reside with and I'm talking about the documents themselves. VCIC has their records. The documents live within the law enforcement agencies and within the state's attorney's offices and the courts, depending on where it is in the system. So kind of to start at the beginning of the process of why would a law enforcement agency run a criminal history? And there are a couple of different reasons. The first being for criminal justice employment purposes, right? You have to know the background of the person that you're hiring. So that's a pretty simple one. You select the proper code, as Director Wallen was talking about, and you get audited, and lo and behold, yep, you hired or didn't hire that person and you're fine. The most common reason is because you have an officer that has come into law enforcement contact with a person. And again, the most common is that they've been taken into custody. Generally, you might get some criminal histories that are for investigative purposes. So you have an officer who is doing an investigation, let's say for drugs, for example, and they want to know that their target's criminal record. So we'll query VCIC and we'll get that person's criminal record. And so we keep that criminal record for the purpose of the investigation. If we don't need it any longer, it is to be shredded. Then you have the instance where we have taken someone into custody. And so we run their criminal record, and we run their Vermont criminal record, and we also run we run their III, so that goes through the country, and we get those records back. So those records are in essentially paper form, right? So they get printed out and they get attached with the case. So we have a physical case at the departments. And so we've got the affidavit, we've got a bail statement, we have any sort of statements from the victims, and that also includes a criminal history. So we keep a copy at our office and we send a copy over to the state's attorney's office. And so the copy that we keep at our office can be it can be a hybrid. It can be a physical copy, and so they put it in a file cabinet and they file it away. And it can be an electronic copy, so they take that physical one, they scan it in, and then they attach it to their incident in Valcor. Or it can be a hybrid, right? Some agencies will keep their paper records, but also keep it electronically. So when we receive, and at that point, pretty much file cabinet's closed, the electronic incident is just kind of sitting there in limbo, and can be queried by, or can be searched by anyone that has law enforcement access and is CJIS certified. You have to be CJIS compliant, meaning you have to pass your background checks and all of that stuff to even access the Valcor
What
system.
does CJIS stand for?
Criminal Justice Information Systems. And so they have a whole, you have to go through every year, you have to go through your training and be certified. And so you have to understand the ideas of security, of, what can and cannot be released, and all of that. And so we have to do that training every year now. Yeah. And so, we are trained in what we can and cannot release. So there's where your paperwork sits at that point. So it goes through its process. The next interaction that we might have with that paperwork is that we get an order from the court. And in this case, let's talk about a seal order. So you can get a seal order for let's say somebody's charged with a single crime, right? So they're charged with DUI, we get an order to seal. That's pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and I'll explain exactly what we do, but that's a pretty easy one. It gets a little more complicated when you've charged somebody with DUI and DLS, and you've received an order to seal for the DLS, but not for the DUI. And that's what we recently just kind of did the functionality for, was to be able to say, okay, seal this offense, but you can't seal the entire record because that DUI is still open and pending. And then of course, there were expungements at that point. So when we seal a record.
And this is really helpful. When you say we, you are at this point in your explanation, what entity?
Okay, so I'm a contractor. I contract my services with Addison County Sheriff's Office, for example.
Okay.
And so when that order to seal comes in, they send it to me. so that,
But you're working for
I can-
Addison County.
Correct.
Okay, great, thank you.
And I just want a second clarification, and this is all happening within the Valcor system. That's where the document management essentially is happening.
or it can be a paper
Could be-
document that somebody has in a file cabinet.
Right.
Is it more often one or the other?
I think most agencies have now moved to storing electronically versus storing on site, although that's just a suspicion
Yeah.
and based on, attachments uploaded and that type of thing.
And when you say store electronically, again, that's on the Valcor system? Just-
Correct.
Okay. Thanks.
Except for there are 3 agencies within the state that are not on Valcor.
Which three are those? I've always thought there's a couple that.
It is Windsor Police Department, Hartford Police Department, and Norwich Police Department. Do you have?
It's down in that area, but I don't recall exactly.
Okay.
So they're just all paper?
They have a different CAD RMS system.
Oh, okay.
They're utilizing Spillman, so I can't speak for those agencies at all. And so when we get that order to seal, the first thing, the order to seal will have the case number on it, it'll have the person's name and date of birth, and it will have the charge that's been sealed. And so we go in and we have a button on the person's name jacket in that incident, and that button says seal, and we click that button. And what that does is then puts a tag on the person's name in that name jacket, and it says sealed. So we have a visual indicator that it was sealed. Additionally, it will replace that person's name in our little arrest frame, Valcor's arrest frame, with the word sealed. Any reports that are run, and I did print off an example of it, but any reports that are run, so let's say an agency runs their arrest report, the name will show sealed. So for example, this arrest report that I'm speaking of, one of them has like arrest charges, the arrestee's name, the town that they were arrested in, that type of thing. So you'll have a long list of names and you'll see sealed. So you can still see the charge, that the charge occurred, because we have to maintain that for NIBR's purposes. So you can see the charge on the report, but you cannot see the person's name. Yes.
I just have a question. So when, like, kind of the distinction between the digital records and the paper records, when paper records are sealed, how does that work in practice?
So when I worked at the sheriff's office, and I can only speak to my procedure, because there are no statewide, like this is how everybody has to do it.
Protocol.
Right. So when I worked at the sheriff's office, we would go to the filing cabinet. This was before we got on Valcor. I would go to the filing cabinet and I would pull that record. I would pull that case file and I would replace it with a paper that had the case number and it would say sealed. Then I would take that case and I would put it in a locked filing cabinet in the sheriff's office. So it was a locked filing cabinet in a locked room.
Yep.
So that's how I did it paper wise. And so, and then to be able, if somebody wanted to look at that case, then they would have to get permission from the sheriff to get a hold of that record.
Yep.
Electronically, all of that is still available to law enforcement. It's the caveat is that the record does say sealed. There is another step that agencies can take where they can seal the entire incident. And when they seal the entire incident, then only people within their own agency can see that sealed incident and those documents.
Everyone else sees nothing.
I'm sorry?
Everyone else.
Everyone else can see that that a case exists, but they cannot see the details of that case. So for example, if I did a search on Director Wallen and I looked at his involvement history, what we call his involvement history, I can see that there's a case number there and who that case number belongs to. And I can see that he had interaction with them, but I can't click on that hyperlink for that case number.
Yes.
So if, this isn't exactly related to the example, but I'm wondering if somebody is trying to figure out to hire someone and one of these records is sealed, are they gonna see, I want to hire Karen Dolan, but something sealed is popping up? And they will see anyone who is trying to do the background to determine if Karen's okay to hire, might see she's got a sealed case. So they might,
So just to be clear, I don't think anybody goes to Valcor or to law enforcement to get that information. They'd be going to VCIC, and VCIC said that if it's sealed, they don't
but-
provide it.
but you said for law enforcement doing their own hiring,
Yes.
they're doing, so if Karen is applying to work in the Essex Police Department, Karen's sealed pop-up is gonna pop up. And it might be, axe
well-
murderer or underwater basket.
Before you go there, subdivision C9 specifically allows law enforcement agencies to access sealed records for their hiring.
Okay,
That's an exception that we
so
have.
you can find out she wasn't the.
Yes, you can find out that
She
it
was the
was
basket
just,
weaver.
it was just defacing a butter crate. It's what-
Right, and, you know, it's important to note that, you know, they can see, like, let's say, for example, I see that, you know, there's a sealed record from Essex, right? There's nothing that, and nothing should stop the agency from contacting Essex to say, you know, I'm looking at hiring this person, you know, what's in the case?
Okay.
And so, you know, I would certainly hope that they wouldn't just look at a record and say, oh.
Right, yes.
So can I ask a follow-up from one of your statements?
Yes.
I want to understand how the scope of the sealed incident, because you mentioned interactions, and I understand that with Valcor, that if law enforcement is called to a scene and an individual's there, they can be reported on Valcor as a witness or whatever, or you know, maybe that eventually leads to a charge that they were involved. I mean, is that all swept into what is sealed or not? You know,
No.
the interactions that have occurred, where does that cut off end?
Sealings only pertain to the charge that comes back from the court. So if that person, I'm not sure, you have to have someone that's charged.
Yeah.
In order to seal the record.
Right, but I'm just wondering if you go back to all the recordings of interactions with that particular individual in Valcor. I mean, is that all that sealed?
No, it only pertains to that incident and that arrest.
Right. So I understand that.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to have the arrest, you have to have the charge. But they're presumably, it's maybe I need just a more general understanding of what gets put into Valcor. Because it could be interactions or involvement history, you said. You know, when does that get tied to the arrest and charge and therefore it could be sealed?
So are you asking if, let's say, for example, I was listed as a person of interest in a couple of drug cases, right? So I've got a case from January, a case from February, and now a case from March. And so they're charged in March. Are you asking if the sealing of that charge would then be retroactive to any contact that?
Yeah, that's my question is,
Right.
are there any of those interactions kind of tied to that charge? And if they're not, they're not. I'm curious.
Right, no, I'm because the cases might be linked together. It's really kind of up to the agency as to, you know, how they relate those things together. I'm just not quite sure. If I didn't provide a good example, can you provide?
Probably not.
Okay.
But Tom might be able to.
I think I know where both people are trying to go. What do we use Valcor for? I mean, other than creating an arrest record, it's not that really what we use it for.
Correct.
It is.
Right, it is for querying, law enforcement contacts is essentially what the RMS side comes down to, the records management system side comes down to. Any interaction that law enforcement has with a person can be recorded in Valcor. And quite honestly, should be recorded in Valcor because there should be some record that law enforcement has come into contact with someone other than, I provided somebody directions or that type of thing. But I think that the guidance, and this again is just guidance, is that if law enforcement comes into contact with a person, then an incident is generated, could be just agency assist, it could be, motorist assist, that type of thing. And that person is entered into Valcor associated to that case.
So could it be like an incident, could be investigation of something? And then that the next incident, they're at the person's house, more investigation. The next one is arrest because they've got their investigation. Are those two previous incidents that are now associated with that arrest, is that part of what would be sealed?
No.
Okay, that's.
Is that part of what would be sealed if the entire incident was sealed?
No, because they'd be separate incidents.
Okay.
Each time you come into contact with someone, generally, you have a new incident created, especially if there's a span of days.
It's not a court case necessarily.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, we're just talking about law enforcement contact.
It's our notes of it.
Right. And it's just that if those minutes are eventually associated with a charge that is sealed, should those also be sealed? And I'm not suggesting they necessarily should. I'm just trying to make sure I understand how that all works. Karen and then Coach.
I think some of it was covered because just as the piece of it's the law enforcement interaction, all of that is entered into it. And so when do law enforcement officers, they have access to all of this information at all times, correct? And this bill is saying that they would have access to sealed records only under exigent circumstances.
Well, and that's where I have some questions
So that's
about.
where I would like to,
about
because
that as well.
that's what I'm here. It's like they have access, you can write down all these notes with any interaction and all of that. And that's how the current system is, right? Like you can look things up and check and do,
Correct.
You're probably audited and checked and all that. But now we're kind of making like only exigent, I don't even remember what that word means, circumstances that you can look at it. So yeah, I'm curious about.
Before we get to that, because that's a whole other kettle of fish, let's go to Coach and here's a question, and then we'll go back to that. Go ahead, Coach.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for your service to the data world.
Thank you.
It seems, thinking of data systems and records, it's fairly parallel to our student record system, whereby we utilize a data pool on an individual student that basically now follows that young person from pre-K all the way through K-12. And if they're in the same school district, we have access to every incident from that period of time. So, you're looking at anywhere from 13 to 14 years because, data is pure that way. And so I think, I'm fairly clear with where we are with the two systems. And then Spellman that we use here in Hartford still has access capability to the national, is my understanding. Is that correct?
I can't speak to what Spillman has or does not have.
Okay, okay. I'll double check. I'll make sure. I think when we started these discussions a couple years ago, that did come up, and I think that I got that answer from the chief at that point. But I'll double check for the committee. Thank you.
Can I ask one clarification before we get into the jellyfish?
Yeah.
Dive in there. So just so I'm getting my terminology right, seal the entire incident, which seals it from sort of like the beginning of the interaction all the way through versus to adjudication
Mhm.
versus, and this is what is the other term for, what's the other type of sealing where they can see everything up to the adjudication and that's what's sealed, if I understood.
Mhm.
No.
Well,
I want to understand what that's called. And so I understand you can seal the entire incident. And then there's another type of
right,
sealing.
right. So we do not have to, we being law enforcement, do not have to seal a record from view. Outside of law enforcement, of course, but for within the RMS, that record is still open and available to all law enforcement agencies and people who are CJIS certified. However, agencies can take the next step. And so what all the agencies would see is that they would see that this record, this incident exists.
Yep.
But the person's involvement in that incident has been sealed, and that's just by virtue of a flag. Some agencies will actually go in. I do personally, I go into the narratives and everything, and I replace the person's name with sealed.
Yep.
That's a manual process. There is no automated process to do that. So I'll open the affidavit. I'll redact, put sealed on over the name and over the date of birth. And then I re-upload that document. And I do that for every document that's in that case, is that I replace the name with sealed. But there's no directive for that. So some agencies may just put sealed on the offense and the arrest, and it just shows up as a flag, or other agencies can take that next step and seal it from view for law enforcement agencies outside of their agency.
And is sealing it from view from agencies outside of their own agency, that's sealing the entire incident?
That is sealing the entire incident.
Okay, and then the other thing was basically
sealing their record or sealing their involvement in that incident.
Yeah. Okay. And then my only other question was, is it possible for the committee to get a an example of like a rap sheet and an example of like a printout of the Valcor, sort of like what we're talking about? I think it would be helpful for me to look at it.
Right. As for the rap sheet, I'm going to tell you no, because the director is here and that's not an authorized secondary dissemination. So you would have to.
That was actually a test, so.
Yeah, exactly.
You passed, good.
But as for a copy of a Valcor record, we do have a demo system that has completely fake data in it, that can be, you can, make an incident and you'd be able to see how that is, but.
I don't know if that's too deep of a dive for this.
I think that, we may try to see if you would be willing to come back maybe next week, because I've been curious for the last 5 years what it actually looks like.
And I'm trying really hard to understand.
So
I can walk you through a little bit of that, okay? So dispatch, what we call punches a case. It's very old school. Dispatch punches a case for an incident. They enter in they or the officers they enter in, there's different frames to the incident, right? So there's how the incident came in. So that's the dispatcher section. Then there's a people detail frame. There's a vehicle frame. There's an arrest frame. There's an offense frame. So we have all of these frames. And so we put in the defendant, for example, we put them into the people detail frame. And the defendant was driving a vehicle and we put that into the vehicle frame. The officer comes in, they go into the incident detail frame and they start entering in their narratives, all of their documents that they need for their case. And they enter in an offense. So you can be suspected of a vandalism, let's say, but never charged for it, right?
Yeah.
So somebody said, he threw a rock through my window. So you would be the suspect of that offense, but you haven't been arrested. So it just sits there and you're the suspect. Then there's the arrest. And so we enter in the arrest and we enter in the arrest charges. And so then when we get that order to seal, we seal the person in the incident. And then we go to the offense and the name has been changed because I selected sealed. The name has been changed to sealed and the arrest in the arrest frame, the name has been changed to sealed. So that allows reports to be run that can be consumed by the public and they don't show the name.
And then is it in the frames that you're then going in and then manually changing? And that's what you were just describing?
Right.
Okay. I'm
Yep.
sorry.
No, that's okay.
That's helpful. And I just wanted to, one clarification, that earlier incident or interaction, whatever it's called, where the person was suspected, but there's not any arrest record, that's still there. That's not sealed.
Correct.
Right. Okay. So just as an example that I heard 4 years ago when we were dealing with this. And so law enforcement can be going out to a call and they look up and they say, oh, we've been at this address before with this person and they have a dog there. And so be careful. No, that's still there.
Oh, yeah.
But if that person was arrested and sealed, that would be, be available. They could access it, but it's sealed and they'd have to treat it differently under this.
Correct.
I was just gonna throw in because it's such a good database for us to be able to track intel. You were the one but you had somebody with you, say Kenny was your little friend with you, right?
Ah.
And now what happened, his record would link to him, right?
Mhm. He would be a known associate.
Known associate, but it wouldn't necessarily, you could see they were together at one time, but not for.
So we're gonna go to that next, but before, just one other question. This is a bigger question. So does federal law enforcement have access to the Valcorp records? It's a state system. Is that correct?
There are federal agencies that have access to Valcorp.
To Vermont's data as well?
Correct.
Which agencies are those?
I don't know all of them. I know that ATF has an ORI, the US Marshals has an ORI. Homeland Security.
Does ORI mean access at all times or?
Sorry, they are an agency on Valve.
Should have unlimited access to it, can look up things at any time.
Provided that they have the proper rules and they have the CJIS certification, then yes.
What does ORI just stand for?
Originating Agency Identifier.
Agency.
Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up from originate. So,
Acronym.
right, it's an old acronym, and the thing is that Valcorp uses it a little interchangeably. That law enforcement we don't. An ORI is simply an FBI assigned number to your agency. Okay, so when I submit NIBRs for an agency, it all goes under that ORI, so the feds know who the data came from.
Okay.
To add, just all those agencies that she brought up too also have state people within those agencies. So there's, cooperation together,
So,
not just data
right.
resources.
But I guess I'm just kind of curious if we have our fair and impartial policing policy and we try to put some limits as far as how much our resources are being used by the feds for strictly federal things, such as immigration enforcement, a little concerned that they have access and can see the interested persons. I mean, that's a lot of data that's on Valcor from all these things, and that's actually a little concerning. All right, anyway, so proceeding to the kettle. It seems like I've discovered a bigger kettle.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fine. A looming.
Right.
I'm going to speak towards sealed.
Yeah, sealed documents on the exigent circumstances and how that's unworkable. I mean, what you think of that?
So obviously I have an interest in the idea of access to sealed records and that type of thing. I look at things from an officer safety point of view. And I have to. My husband is a police officer. I have to. And so the idea that, and when I read this, I was very concerned about this idea about supported by a written affidavit with access, the court shall grant access to the record upon finding reasonable suspicion exists. So right now, the way that it works is anybody in law enforcement that is CJIS certified can see sealed records through Valcor. Okay. If we then say, well, no, we're going to restrict that access so that you have to, petition the court and wait to get that information. Meanwhile, that sealed information is assault on a law enforcement officer, and my law enforcement officer is in contact with that person right there. That doesn't work. That does not work.
So would that fall into an exigent circumstance, or I guess how?
Well, you can't wait.
No, how would that?
Right. I mean, and how can you wait and file something with the court to know what was sealed when he's in contact with that person right now?
So that's one of the exceptions is having to file for use, but the other is it's C3 is if they can access, well, I would say use sealed record under exigent circumstances.
Right. But if you're somehow removing them from our access.
No, let's say they have access. I think that needs to be corrected throughout here.
Okay.
That it's use we're talking about, it's not access. So they have access to that sealed record, but are they allowed to use it? They can use it in an exigent circumstance. I don't know how to define that. I need to understand. Well, there's a definition here. I'd like to understand from witnesses how, in fact, that would or wouldn't work.
And the question becomes, under what circumstances does an officer need access to a sealed record with permission from the court if, in fact, and we're talking about the documents, if in fact those documents still live within the Valcor system? If you wanted to quote something, what I can see is that if a law enforcement officer wanted to use information that was in a sealed record as part of their investigation, i.e. stuff that goes to court, then I could see where they'd have to say, I want to reference this sealed case and get permission from the court for that. So I can see, and from the officer aspect, of course, they don't want to have to do that. They don't have to do that right now. But I can see where that could happen. But as for, and what my fear is that this is going to restrict access to viewing sealed records, documents.
So would a law enforcement officer have any idea what's in that sealed record if they were not granted access. I mean, if there's some way that you could prevent them, which it sounds like you can't, it's just flagged as sealed. But if they can't see the sealed document.
Then
how would
why
they-
not expunge it?
Right. And well, how would they know what is in that document?
If they can't see it, they won't.
Right. So that's why, I mean, the access doesn't make sense to me because they wouldn't know. But all right. Karen and I think Ken had his hands up as well.
Yeah, so, and I think I was just trying to look up, you weren't able to provide testimony to the other body.
No, I was not.
I just feel like there's some pieces here that
Right.
we're putting together. Or not. Yeah, so this is very helpful. And I agree. I think the access thing is an important word, but the suggestion of changing it to use, it seems like that isn't very well defined either. Like, what does use mean? And so, like, why even have it? Like, maybe, like, I'm leaning towards, like, just not even have that limitation on it, because we would need to define what is use.
What would be criminal justice purposes, just to be.
But then that brings us back to the first one, which is you have to get a petition in order to do it. So we don't even need this piece of the access.
Well, except for what we just heard as far as there could be, I mean, it depends, I mean, a use could be investigation, could be detention. And if the person, apprehension, that's another one. The situation you just mentioned, the officers called there and what's behind the sealed document. I don't know that assault on law enforcement is actually sealable.
Yeah.
I know, that's,
Let's assume that it is, or something else that's less, that could say this person might be violent. And you want the law enforcement officer to know that. But that's a criminal justice purpose, because presumably it's apprehension or investigation. It's pretty broad what those uses are. But I do, yeah, so we need to explore this a little bit more to understand from law enforcement as well. So Ken, did you have a question? Yeah, Karen.
The
and
other
then-
thing too is the access is also in 2A on page 25. So it's under that one too. So I do feel like we need to clarify, yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll hear more witnesses on that one.
Okay, and will you help us come to figure out how we're going to get to new language to tie up all these things?
Well, we can all try together. Yes.
Oh, goody.
And then we're going to get suggestions from witnesses, I have a feeling.
Oh, we are good. That's great.
Ken and then.
Or the town.
Go ahead.
Oh.
Yes.
This is sort of the weird part about having somebody's criminal record stored or their case stored within our database, which is meant to be an intel database for us to track what we're doing so that we can go back and put our cases together. For instance, I could have a notebook and write all this information down and keep it with me all the time and never see anything about feeling anything. I'm also going to know when I'm out on the street working with the same people all day long, you know, I've had an interaction with a person, I got hit, and I hear them stop that person and say, hey, Ian hit me the other day, and I can put that over there. And I didn't have to go to Valcor to see it. What we're doing is then at that point, if we seal that, is we're removing the ability to do that if we take it out to the person who wasn't working that night.
Right.
If there's a charge and an arrest that is sealed, well, shit to that. But from what I'm understanding, if that's just.
The interaction is the only thing I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the charge. I'm just what happened leading up to the charge in the courtroom and then the conviction. There was a set of circumstances that occurred that could be putting that officer in jeopardy now.
Right.
And I should be able to acknowledge that and say that to that police officer or the radio or the dispatcher could, or somebody else, say, be careful, this is why.
Right.
I get it, you know,
I'm
I
not
don't-
saying
I don't-
I'm convicted of this or anything like that.
and I don't know if this goes that far in saying that because you had an experience. So you're relaying your experience to that officer, not making a commentary that he's been convicted of this. So I think, I
And
don't,
then I'm gonna put it in Valcor and then somebody may take it away, then the next person down the road, a week later, when I'm not working, doesn't have benefit of that knowledge and gets hurt.
But it sounds from our interaction or discussion on this is that it's the arrest forward is what is being sealed or would be sealed. It's not perhaps these interactions that have occurred. That's kind of what I was trying to clarify, and that's my understanding that that's the practice. And I don't know that we're writing anything in here that changes that, but we should. Well, yeah, maybe we need to define that a little further, that it's, the arrest and.
My question is, from the RMS side of the house, it doesn't sound necessarily like much would change on the RMS side of the house. So we would still, if we got an order to seal from the court, we would still put a seal on that name record. The change would be, and again, if that's not the direction that this is going, then fantastic. But the change would be what is still viewable to law enforcement in the RMS system. I don't know what the original intent of this is. Right? It seems like there.
Which this, the whole thing, or just that one part?
I would go for all of chapter 30, sealing and expunging. I don't know what the change, what the Oedipus was for these changes to what we already have.
I think I can tell you, just at a very high level, it is to move from expungement to sealing so that there can be use of those records in the appropriate circumstances. That when those documents disappear, they can't be used for legitimate purposes. So that's one part. That's on the one side. On the other side, the kind of the give and take in our political world is that also allows us to expand some of the offenses that can be sealable so that individuals, when they're looking for a job or a home or whatever, can say, I don't have a criminal record, which is what this provides.
Okay.
So,
in speaking to that, where you folks have all misdemeanor offenses except, one of the exceptions is not assault on a law enforcement officer. And I firmly believe
okay,
as
I appreciate you
that
pointing it out.
that needs to be in there.
Yeah.
And clarify, so if a record was expunged right now, officers, law enforcement would still be able to see that in Valcourt now. There'd be no record of it. Would it say expunged or?
They would, so what happens is with an expungement is that we receive the expunge order. I do the same steps that I do with the sealing, is that I pull up all of the documents and any reference to the person, I redact those completely. So they cannot be brought back. The person's name is removed from that Valcourt incident, that particular Valcourt record for that arrest. So the only thing that remains is the data that is needed to submit NIBRs, which is, race, age, gender, those type of things. But there's nothing identifiable to that person that remains in that incident. In the offense section, the name is completely replaced with the word expunged. And in the arrest section, the name is completely replaced by the word expunged. So you cannot search your name and find reference to that arrest at all.
So if a law enforcement officer had an interaction with somebody, they'd look them up, like, what's this person? They would not be able to see.
They would not see it.
So I think that too is also the balance that we're trying to find with this bill. There are folks that want to have the benefits of like the full expungement, but we're going with sealing, and how do we navigate that? So
right,
that's helpful to know that if in an expungement, law enforcement has zero access to it.
Correct. And if there are physical files, they are shredded.
So this may not be a question that you want to answer, but I'm wondering, because one of the things that we've read when we were looking at expungement and sealing was like after X amount of years, a person who's had nothing else happen is at no greater risk. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about a time frame where it doesn't feel like it is worthwhile and valuable in terms of law enforcement safety.
I don't have an opinion on that.
Okay,
I think that would be something for Sheriff Anderson or.
sure. No, I mean, you're raising like really interesting, like it's just so helpful that your work and life experience is what it is. I think you're a wealth of information and thought about it.
And I appreciate the opportunity to be open in this committee.
We appreciate it too.
So I had just a other question. So back to just making sure I understand this one part, as far as federal access to the Valcor data, the ATF, US Marshals, Homeland Security. Is that pursuant to MOUs? How do they have authority to have that access?
Yeah, that I don't have the answer to. I can't speak to that. Again, I would defer that to Sheriff Anderson, as I believe he was the head of the Valcor Governance Board at the time.
Okay.
That access was granted. So I don't know if it had to go through the governance board. I don't know how it happened. I do know that those agencies do exist on our system.
Another question kind of related to that is, on Valcor, is immigration status included as information?
No, there is no field for immigration status at all.
Well, that eases, I think, some people's minds. Okay, all right. Any other questions? And it would be great if we could get you to do a demo possibly in the next week or something like that.
Maybe like a shared screen up.
Yeah, but yeah, it could even be a shared screen. You don't have to come back in, you can. So
I need a
yeah.
refresher.
yeah, he needs a refresh. He needs really. So we are going to take a break, hopefully only 5 minutes. Knowing that that's going to be more like 10. And if we don't get to everybody, we have a very short floor session this afternoon, and we'll be continuing with testimony this afternoon. So if we don't, I guess, Tucker, I think you're third on the list. If we don't get to you, hopefully you're available. And if you can't come back this afternoon, we'll get in tomorrow. Then again, maybe Todd and Kim will be very short. All right, we'll go off live.
Why not move?
Well, I guess we're not off live because our person's not here. So-
Why not move Tucker up? Because the other two are in here all the time.
Well, Tucker's in here all the time. Okay.